Now, I want to say sometimes in the past, the slides on my screen will change, but for some reason they won't change for the viewers. Or are you all looking at a forest? Okay, good. If for some reason what I'm saying doesn't align with what you're looking at, let me know. That happens to me fairly often. Friends, I'm going to take you through a journey that has been the last almost 20 years, really, in my life's work, in a place called Leadville, Colorado. Some of you must be very familiar with Leadville, and others not so much. Leadville is an old silver mining town that started as a gold mining camp in the 1860s. The silver boom in Leadville began around 1877, 78, and became one of the largest silver rushes in the history of North America, peaking in the 1880s. So, as part of that silver rush, Leadville had an enormous Irish immigrant community of as many as 3,000 plus Irish born people living in Leadville in the early 1880s. So I concentrated my research on understanding this ethnic community, their role in the town, their role in the labor movement, etc. So I'm going to start at the end and circle back to the end later. This is the pauper section of Leadville's Evergreen Cemetery. What you're looking at are sunken holes holding remains, human remains. This is in the back of the main cemetery. It hasn't been cared for. There's no grass, there's no watering. It's just been forgotten for decades, for 140 years, really. Roads were built through it. All-terrain vehicles and motorcycles regularly drive right over these. But there are upwards of 6,000 of these graves, and these are people who couldn't afford the $15 burial fee. Um, so what's striking is that there are more unmarked graves. There are more paupers' graves in this cemetery than there are marked graves, and that tells you everything you need to know about Leadville. Leadville was a space where immigrant labor was exploited, and these communities did their best to fight back and resist the situations they were in, but it was very difficult for them to do so. Um, the average age of the people buried in these holes is 22, and half of them are children. So this is a very powerful space, and this is one of the most important spaces in the Rocky Mountains, in my view. And this is now one of the most important spaces in the Irish diaspora, since we're building a memorial here to put the names of the people buried here etched in glass. So, as I said, I'll circle back to this because I want to end with the story of the memorial, but I have a lot to cover before we get there. There are some scattered markers in the pauper section. These are families who found the plot where their loved ones buried, and they put a marker down years or decades after the person died. Okay, Leadville, Colorado, went from a few hundred gold seekers to close to 40,000 people in the span of a few years, and beginning in about 1878. By the early 1880s, Leadville rivaled Denver for the largest city in Colorado. And the other piece of information you need to know about Leadville is it's the highest incorporated town in North America, 10,200 feet. So you have to try to imagine the brutality of the winters in Leadville. Even today, a lot of lowlanders, those of us who might live in the Denver or the Front Range, probably would struggle to make it through a Leadville winter if we lived there. The only remaining piece of Irish culture that lives today in Leadville is the third Saturday of September, when the town has what they call their St. Patrick's Practice Parade. And this is halfway to St. Patrick's Day, and the march is about 4 blocks long, and it where they take a 90-degree turn into the Silver Dollar Saloon. So this is still a wonderful tradition. When we started the idea for the memorial, we reached out to the Irish government. So I guess I'll tell you the story of how this memorial got started. Is a friend of mine reached out to me. He knew from my writing and my speeches about the cemetery with the pauper graves. And he said, Jim, we need to reach out to the Irish government. They'll be interested in this. And I didn't think the Irish government would much care for some small town cemetery. But the Irish government immediately sent the local consulate general, Adrian Farrell, who visited Leadville in 2016. That's him on the left in the sunglasses. And they moved to St. Patrick's Practice Parade to coincide with his visit and put him in an old fire truck. And that's what's got the ball rolling for this memorial. About 100 of us gathered that day in the cemetery and made a commitment to name the unnamed, as we say, to make sure that the names of the people buried there were remembered. 3 years later, in 2019, the ambassador to Ireland, that's him in the red tie, Daniel Mulhall, visited Leadville, and we were able to walk him through the cemetery. And so by this time, the Irish government was fully on board with this effort. And of the nearly $300,000 we've raised, about half of it has come from the Irish government. And the reason is that the diaspora to the Irish government is extremely important and valued. So anything around the world that reflects the stories of Irish exiles, don't forget that there's only 5 million people in Ireland, but worldwide, over 80 million people consider themselves Irish. So chew on that for a minute as we continue. This is a piece of art in County Mayo to the coffin ships, as they were called. And the people who ended up in Leadville were really the children of the famine generation. So it meant some of them had survived the famine themselves as children or as young people, but the majority were the next generation. So they knew abject poverty. They had come from mining regions around Ireland and around North America. And so they were a very destitute population, drifting transient population. These are just some memorials. I'm going to skip through these. So the Irish in Leadville contributed greatly to the labor movement. Their wages were $3 a day. And twice, miners in Leadville launched massive strikes led by Irish miners. The first was in 1880, the second was in 1896. And this is a Union ribbon that would have been worn by miners in the 1896 strike. The first strike was a Knights of Labor strike. The second strike was the Western Federation of Miners strike. Both strikes were put down by the Colorado National Guard, somewhat violently. In the case of the first strike, not a single act of violence was committed during the strike, but the Colorado National Guard was sent to Leadville, and they occupied Leadville, and their orders were to arrest striking miners and force them to work in chain gangs building roads. And that's how the strike was broken. That strike was led by a young 28-year-old miner named Michael Mooney from Dublin, and he was quite a working class intellectual. He didn't have any formal schooling, but he was incredibly skilled politically, and he was a great leader. So I've written about him quite a bit, and this is me dressed up as him and the St. Patrick's practice parade. On the right, you can see me with my pickaxe. I was trying to inspire the people of Leadville to another strike, but it didn't work out so well. This is Mooney here. This is the only photo I've ever been able to find of him, and that includes after being in touch with his descendants, his direct descendants. They don't even have photos of him. But when my book is published, his name will be well known. A photo of some striking Irish miners. You can see the ribbons on their lapels. In the second strike in 1896, a faction of the Union organized and armed themselves because the mines were being reopened with scab labor, with replacement workers. And the Irish were very upset about this. So a faction, a splinter group, who called themselves the Regulators, packed some of these scab run mines in the middle of the night to retake them. But the guards were ready for the attack because the Union had been infiltrated, and at least 6 people died that night, but the real number of deaths could be as high as 24 or 25. And this is a guard that is one of the mines that was attacked was the Robert Emmet mine, ironically. And here's a National Guardsman keeping watch over the Robert Emmet mine during that second strike. This strike was also crushed under martial law militarily. And the wages of these miners were still $3 a day, 17 years after the first strike. So even though these strikes were not successful, they contributed greatly to the trajectory of the labor movement here in Colorado and gave courage to other miners elsewhere. They were asking for an 8-hour day, a $4 a day wage, better safety conditions, and the right to form a union. Those were their 4 big asks. This is the Irish-built Annunciation Catholic Church. It still stands in Leadville today. It is one of the oldest Catholic churches in the state and the highest church in the state, as they like to brag. You can see how beautiful it is with Mount Massive in the background. This is the church where Molly Brown was married. This is the church where Michael Mooney was married. And today it serves largely a Spanish-speaking population. The Irish abandoned Leadville beginning in the 1890s, and Leadville went into a deep decline. But today, Leadville is 40% immigrant, mostly from Chihuahua, because Leadville is the only affordable, semi-affordable community left in this region, and that's changing quickly. the real estate in Leadville has skyrocketed. The housing prices have gone way up, so it's no longer as affordable to workers and immigrant workers as it once was. This is a map of Leadville Irish concentrated on what is the east side. This is the east side of town. The 6th Street was so Irish, they called it the 6th Street Irish. And the mining district was just to the east of the Irish district. Some of these mines were right in the Irish district, which added to the tensions. So I'm going to skip through some of these. Well, this is just a chart that shows the ethnic groups that lived in Leadville at this time. So you can see from this that the Irish were by far the largest ethnic group. The numbers of men and women in this second column is about a 4 or 5 to 1 ratio of men to women in Leadville. So you can see, and many of these Canadians are Canadian Irish. The England is mostly Cornish. There was a large Cornish community there. But you can see these are mostly people from Northern and Western Europe. That would change by the 1890s, shift drastically toward people from Eastern Europe. So in terms of where people came from in Ireland itself, these are the most common counties of origin based upon the church records. So you can see that County Cork contributed around a third of all the Irish, and that's because of the copper mines in the Beara Peninsula near a village called Allihies. That's where most of them came from. And today, because of my research, I reached out to this village, rode my bike there from Dublin one summer, and formed a partnership. And last March, a delegation from Allihies came to Leadville, and they are now sister cities. In Ireland, they call it twinning. We call it sister cities. So that's another benefit that's come out of this project. These are the states that the Irish Americans, US born, came from. So New York and Pennsylvania were by far the most common. But all of these states had mining. In New York, it was not just New York City, but it was the Adirondack mines up near Lake Champlain. Pennsylvania, it was overwhelmingly the anthracite coal region where the famed Molly Maguires were hanged in the 1870s. And my student did an amazing graduate project where she traced dozens of alleged Molly Maguires from Pennsylvania to Leadville, some of whom had changed their names because the Pinkertons were hunting them. So she's now writing about this strong connection between the Pennsylvania Molly Maguires and Leadville. The reason Wisconsin's high on this list is the lead mines of southwestern Wisconsin and northwestern Illinois. The reason Michigan's high on this list are the copper mines of the Upper Peninsula. So these are really Nova Scotia was another prominent origin. So these Irish miners often settled in other mining communities in the North America, and their sons and daughters moved to more promising mining areas like Leadville and Butte, Montana. So 62% of all the Irish-born men in Leadville were miners, worked underground. Of the women, the majority who were single and could earn a wage worked as servants and laundresses. It just gives you an idea of the kind of labor they were doing. Here's a photo of a washing business. And by the way, some of the great tensions that existed in the American West between Irish and Chinese were rooted in the competition between Irish women and Chinese men in the laundry business. There's head-to-head competition. And in Leadville, they banned Chinese from living there. There was a Chinese ban in Leadville. Not a single Chinese-born resident shows up in the census of 1880. This was a strict ban. Here's Michael Mooney's grave with his wife, Sarah, and he died after the strike ended, he had to leave Leadville. He lived in Seattle, Butte, Montana, and ended his life in Los Angeles. And that's where he's buried. And I flew there to find his grave. This just highlights the parts of Ireland where most of them came from. Here's the Beara Peninsula down here in the southwestern corner. But these other counties contributed large numbers of miners. Leadville, Tipperary, Waterford, because of the copper mines in Waterford, the silver mines in northern Tipperary. Many came from Mayo and Donegal, who had fled during the famine and worked the anthracite mines of eastern Pennsylvania before moving to Leadville. Many came from a place in northern England called Cleator Moor. It's a mining community in northern England. Irish miners moved from Ireland to Cleator Moor, And then a generation or two later, they left Cleatormore and made their way to Leadville. So many of them worked first in northern England or Scotland before they moved to North America. These are just some of the places in North America where they mined. Well, the coal fields of eastern PA, iron mines of the Adirondacks, the lead mines of southwest Wisconsin, the copper mines of the Michigan Upper Peninsula. This gives you an indication of Michael Mooney's let's see, his speech that he gave when the strike broke out. And it gives you a little bit of a window into the miners' situation. So just so you know what miners were facing at this time in these hard rock camps in the Rocky Mountains around 1880. Gentlemen, you may ask and wonder at the cause of this enthusiastic demonstration until I tell you that it is a result of careful consideration and forethought. We have simply concluded that our compensation is too small and we demand an increase in our wages from $3 to $4 per day and a reduction in our working hours from 10 to 8 hours. We think that we are acting right and that our demands are just, every superintendent and foreman having agreed with us upon this point. Here we are today in a high altitude and living in the mines, breathing in the bad and stifling gases, with every danger of impairing our health and losing our lives. Not only this, gentlemen, but we have been denied the privilege of thinking and acting for ourselves, and that to which, as freemen, we are entitled to. Now we are told not to talk with each other while at work and are strictly ordered not to smoke. This is a small privilege, gentlemen, and God knows that living in continual candlelight is gloomy enough. Now we have just come to this conclusion, that if they can pull the reins, we can pull tighter, and we are determined to have our rights no matter what comes. We can't stand this oppression, and we declare it right here. So this was a big moment in Colorado history, that the Colorado economy came to a standstill, and the Colorado government responded as if it was an armed insurrection. This is my favorite quote from Mooney. I don't know that the whole American flag covers me, but I think I have a corner. And it sort of, to me, embodies the larger struggle that these immigrant miners faced for respect. This is a newspaper quote, and it reflects the attitude toward the Irish at this time. The Molly Maguires must find a reservation outside of Colorado. Leadville drove the Chinese out, but admits Molly Maguires. The discrimination was a bad one. I'm going to skip through some of this for just time's sake. Here's the church as it looks today with the rectory. If you're ever in Leadville, it's one of the most beautiful churches you'll find. Well worth a visit. This is the old hospital, Irish Catholic hospital, that was run by Sisters of Charity of Leavenworth, Kansas. And it's now been renovated into lofts, condominiums. And it's also well worth seeing. The original hospital was torn down. This was built in 1900. This was the second version. Before the windows and doors were even in, people started leaving maimed and injured miners on the doorstep. So the nuns just started treating them, even though the building wasn't finished yet. The nuns' motto was they would never turn anyone away, regardless of their religion, their race, their culture, their nationality. And they lived that mission. They never turned anyone away. So I cycled to Allihies in 2019 to let the people know about this historical connection to Leadville. They know about the connection to Butte, Montana, but they did not know about the connection to Leadville. This is Tig O'Sullivan, who runs the local copper mining museum, and Allihies is now twin. He was part of the delegation. Allihies and Leadville are now twin.
Wait a minute.
So I was received in Leadville, and over the last 5 years, I receive these kinds of emails on a daily basis. People looking for long lost relatives. And it's really rewarding for me to help people find them. And I built a website called the Rocky Mountain Irish Roots Collective with all of the databases, and cemetery records on that website that are available to the public. This is the St. Patrick's Practice Parade. And here's what the memorial will look like. It's almost complete. It has a statue in the middle, surrounded by panels with the names on them, and spiral walkways take you to the center. There'll be benches where people can sit and reflect, interpretive kiosks, and the graves themselves are a couple of 100 feet away. So that's this is what it looks like, what it will look like. It's almost complete, and the unveiling is in September 16th. You all should consider coming to Leadville for the unveiling, September 16th, everyone. This has been a labor of love for me. And when the Irish abandoned Leadville, they tended to go to Denver, like Molly Brown did and her husband, or to Cripple Creek, where there was another gold rush in the turn of the century. Many went to Butte, Montana, and many headed west to California. So the diaspora, the transience of the people continued. There's Liam, the statue named Liam, and this is taken about a year ago. You can see some of the Celtic designs on the harp. He's facing this massive piece of granite that was taken from Climax Mine. And he's looking east toward Ireland. One of the things we did, we felt the need to do this, is to reach out to the original inhabitants of this land. It's the Southern Ute Nation. And Cassandra came. She's the cultural director of the Southern Ute Nation, and she blessed the ground for us before the memorial was built. That was incredibly meaningful to the Irish community, given that the Irish have a deep understanding of displacement and occupation. And so to be able to honor the Southern Ute Nation as we do this work meant a lot to us. So here's a Belfast photographer, Sean McKernan, who has taken some of the iconic photos of the Troubles in Belfast. He's presenting a photograph to Cassandra that he took in the 80s in Belfast of American Indian movement activists with Jerry Adams in Belfast in solidarity. And he's presenting her with his photograph. And there's Cassandra blessing the ground at the dedication ceremony. And this the most recent unveiling of the statue that happened last September. And we've gotten quite an amount of press on this. This is an Irish Times article that was published a year ago. And lots of North American media have covered it. It's become a big story in the Irish American community. And this little cemetery and memorial have come to represent so much more than just those buried there. It's come to represent Irish immigrants everywhere who drifted west and were never heard from again. They're the lost Irish. That's what this cemetery represents, the lost Irish. So the people we hear from whether they find their family member or not in the cemetery, they consider this a sacred space. And for Irish Americans, I believe this space represents the toll that industrial labor had on our ancestors. The numbers, the tens of thousands that were lost, died, injured to industrial labor, railroad work, canal building, mining, factory work. So I'll stop there, and I want to just field some of your questions. If you have any, I'd love to hear from you. This is my kid who's been a big instrumental part in this whole journey and loves to be part, probably answer the questions better than I could. Anyway, Mike, you want to start?
You're muted, Mike.
Yeah, this is not only a terrific presentation and what you're doing up there, but it's a relevant thing to me personally because we have discovered a small cemetery which is largely of Cornish miners and their wives and their children who died, both wives and children who died in childbirth. And this is out in about 5 miles south of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And it's been abandoned for really since the 1870s when the mines temporarily closed and all the Cornishmen moved out. So they had a Methodist chapel there, which was serving the Cornishmen, but this chapel went away too right after the community moved away. So we have no records of this, but we do have tombstones, and they're all vandalized. The whole place is overgrown with blackberry bushes and every other kind of fierce-looking thorn. It's not anywhere near the number of graves that you're dealing with, but because there are stones, we have managed to piece some of them together, and have traced about half of the people, including everyone has a story, you know, and it's just amazing what you kind of find out of. So I was sort of interested in your information sources. I mean, it's been mostly sort of a genealogy thing for the ones that we had a starting point with a name on a stone, because we have no cemetery records whatsoever.
Thanks so much, Mike. I just had a conversation with a park ranger in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and they're looking at some cemeteries there in a very similar way. The thing is, these mining communities were poor spaces, and so a lot of times people were buried in haphazard ways and unmarked, and these cemeteries have been overgrown and forgotten. So if this project we're doing here inspires other efforts elsewhere, then that really brings us a lot of joy. All the hard rock mines in Colorado had large Cornish communities, and so I think that one thing you might consider is if there's an effort, if you can get enough effort and momentum, clean up that space and kind of make it a public space again where people can visit and learn. It will be so much more than just a genealogy project, but it'll be a space where people can be educated about the lives of 19th century Cornish miners. And that cemetery could then lead to other efforts elsewhere. So I've grown fond of working with the dead. It's much easier than working with the living. and so anyway, I wish you luck. If please reach out if you want to talk more. We were lucky because there were cemetery records, so we do have the names, at least most of them. There's a lot that are buried there that weren't recorded, but we at least have most of the names. And what we decided to do, even though the majority are Irish, is to put all the names on the memorial. We didn't feel right about leaving people out. So it's an Irish memorial, but it includes all the names. But thanks so much, Mike, and reach out if you want to know more. If you have questions, I'll put my email in the chat, everyone, and welcome you to write to me.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah.
Jim, any information on like the primary cause of death? Since it's not just miners, it's all the Irish. Were there any plagues or, what happened when, how many died when, or anything like that?
Yeah, we found a few epidemics. There's quite a serious smallpox epidemic in 1883, a couple of scarlet fever epidemics, and most of the victims were children, at least in the smallpox. There's one new headstone. Someone put it there over the last year, and it's an the Flannery family, and they had 11 children, and seven of them died in epidemics. There's another family, the Slavin family. There were two Slavin brothers. Between the two of them, they lost 9 children, and they're all buried together. So the horrors of this begin to reveal themselves when now the most common cause of death listed in the records is pneumonia. But we're learning that their understanding of pneumonia was different than what we understand pneumonia as today. Pneumonia was kind of a catch-all term that was used to describe everything. A lot of women died in childbirth. And one of my students did a great project where she traced every single woman buried in the pauper section. And she was able to find causes of death for 70% of the women. And it's extraordinary how many died by violence, which by that I mean suicide, homicide, domestic violence, or accidents was actually the leading cause of death for these women. So we're getting this amazing window into the lives of working class communities in mining camps through this cemetery. Any other questions?
Jim, have you run across any information on class disparity between the poor Catholic Irish and the managerial Protestant Irish?
Yeah, there were some Irish involved in ownership of one or two of the mines. Nothing like existed in Butte. In Butte, there were many mines that were Irish owned. And that's what made Butte so attractive to Irish miners, is they felt they'd get a better shake up there. In Leadville, we're not seeing a lot of that. A lot of the mines were owned by absentee owners who lived in New York. Some of them were English owned. And so the Irish miners felt like they were part of a struggle that they left behind them in Ireland that continued here in the United States. In the Irish World, which was a Irish American newspaper that the miners in Leadville all read, they equated the industrial labor struggle with the Irish nationalist struggle as two parts of the same struggle. So, but it's clear that the Irish were the most working class of all the ethnic groups because they had the highest number of men who worked underground. For other ethnic groups, it was around 50%, 40%. For the Irish, it was nearly 2/3. So they were at the bottom of the social ladder, and they felt that they had to act in a more radical way, which meant organizing and striking. When that strike was launched, the business community in Leadville organized, and they used their leverage to get the governor to declare martial law, and they formed their own march. And that march ended in a melee, but the intent of the march was to intimidate the miners. But the miners called the march an army of snobs because they were middle class and business owners marching down, with many with weapons and being deputized as strikebreakers. And the miners just couldn't believe how ridiculous this looked. So the class tensions were extremely real, but the union was strong. This was not just an Irish union. This was a union of all the ethnic groups together. And for just that moment, they were able to overcome all the ethnic rivalries that had divided them. So that was a beautiful thing to read about how they overcame that.
Oh, okay, but I guess I was looking for if you run across anything, if, specific Irish Protestant Catholic divide. My great grandfather was one of the owners of the Colonel Cellars in Leadville. And he was second generation Irish from St. Louis. And in researching the Irish in St. Louis, there's a very good book about the Irish in St. Louis. And one of the paragraphs is, this is mainly about the Catholic Irish because they remained a cohesive unit, whereas the Protestant Irish mainstreamed with the other white Protestant people in St. Louis. So there was, at least in St. Louis, there was a big divide between the Protestant Irish and the Catholic Irish.
Yeah, and of course, by this time, Protestant Irish were very mainstream. So many American presidents come from Protestant Irish roots. So that's an example of that. The only indication I found of those tensions, Barbara, was the Irish Catholics had their own militia called the Mulligan Guard, and the Scots Irish had a militia called the Highland Guard. And they decided to have dinner together to talk when the strike was breaking out, because both of these militias were refusing to put down the strike when they were called out by the governor. Instead of putting down the strike, they disbanded their militia. Think about that. They refused to go out and put down a strike that was Irish strike. So they had dinner, talk about their strategy, and the dinner spiraled into a disagreement, an argument, and they left in a huff, I guess, and never worked together. That's the only indication I had of that, because there weren't a lot of Protestant Irish in Leadville. The community would have been much smaller, and those who were in Leadville didn't identify as Irish as much as they identified as American. So they just had vastly different identities. Any other questions?
Yeah, let me come back to the kind of the statistics again that you presented, which I thought were really great. We just did this on this township for where the cemetery was located. We had kind of a similar sort of pattern, and had to do some different lumping of occupations together that were probably different from where the Census Bureau lumped things. But what percentage do you think you'll actually have that will be unfound or unremembered? Right word?
Yeah. That's a great question, because the people that know this cemetery better than I are people who worked for decades in the library as archivists, and they've all retired now. The people who currently work there don't have nearly the knowledge level, but these retired archivists are so incredibly knowledgeable. And every one of them, to a person, told me that there's hundreds more who are buried there who aren't in the records. And I've come to see the value of that, because you can see where burials happened in a haphazard way. Maybe just a family took a body out and buried it themselves. So I wouldn't know how to guess how many of those there are. I would say maybe 10%, 10 to 20% more than the names that we have. But we're finding names of people, and we're still trying to figure out where they're buried. I also found that people of color, Black people, Mexican-born people, are also buried in the pauper section. Those communities were so small, there wasn't a separate space for them, and so they were buried in the pauper section. For example, in one of the blocks that's all babies, in the middle of that block is a 40-year-old Black man who was buried there, and he's listed in the records as unknown Black man. That's all it says. Another says unknown Mexican killed on railroad. And those references have become very important to us, because almost like the tomb of the unknown soldier, the tomb of the unknown worker. And I think it's also a source of pride that we're learning that this pauper cemetery is a multiracial space where people who work together and suffered together are also buried together. So this cemetery continues to speak to us in its own pace. Every time I go out there, I see something new that I haven't seen in the past. And I'm putting in the chat the information on the unveiling of the memorial in September. If you come to this, you won't be disappointed. It's an entire weekend of events that'll be happening, including a new museum exhibit that my students are putting together. So thanks, Mike, for your question. Yeah. Anyone else before we wrap it up? Barbara, thanks for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to
Well,
be able to
thank you
give this
for
presentation.
that. And I'm glad I'm so sorry that I messed everything up, but I'm glad everybody else joined on time and you guys all stuck around. I think this was a talk worth staying around for. And it's a topic that really, is kind of unique. Although at the conference, we do have a session on cemetery topics. It's the last session at the conference. So kind of a little preview on cemeteries maybe for this one.
I encourage anyone to write to me, email me if you have any questions. I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Nice job.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. And thanks everybody else for sticking around.